after the 50th, there are obviously a lot more veterans here then than there are now, but there are a lot more people here now than there were then. Like there seem to be more, tourists isn't really the right sounding word, but there are a lot more people.
They're
who
pilgrims
come.
in a way.
Pilgrims in a way.
Yeah.
How do you explain it?
Well, I've been thinking about it a lot, and I think what has happened is, given the nature of the world in which we live today, and in America and the United States especially, they're having a hard time coming to grips with who are we, and where do we want to go, and how are we going to get there. And then their grandparents are dying off, or they're reading obituaries, and they realize what that generation did. And they think, oh my God, the magnitude of that. And then they step one step deeper into it. It was the greatest war in the history of mankind. 60 million people perished. All the continents were involved with the exception of Antarctica. And the size of it and the consequence of it really gripped people. And as a result of the interest in the last 20 years or so, schools are assigning papers on it. There are World War II studies programs now. There's a World War II memorial in Washington, museum in New Orleans, and others around the country. I think it took us this long to come to grips with it, quite honestly.
You call them the greatest generation, not just the D-Day group, but
No.
the D-Day group certainly part of it. Why these guys?
Well, I thought about it before I used the phrase, and I actually used the phrase here on the 50th anniversary for the first time on the air. It kind of was implanted in my mind on the 40th anniversary. And I was looking for a summary phrase, and I finished by saying, they came through the Depression when they learned about deprivation and sacrifice and working together, and then they were asked immediately to go off and save the world in the war, and then came home and built us the country that we have today. I think it's the greatest generation any society has ever produced. Now, I get pushback on that, obviously. My short answer is, that's my story and I'm sticking to it. The longer answer is, for example, preeminent American historian David McCullough is a friend of mine. He said, Tom, the Founding Fathers. And I said, I understand. Smaller group, didn't give women any rights, and allowed slavery to go on. These guys, imperfect, came home, including African Americans, and said, we will not let discrimination stand. And then other white veterans of that war were principles in changing our attitudes about race in America. Vietnam, greatest generation, a lot of them were principal architects. The people who pushed back hard against the war, McCarthy and McGovern and Frank Church, all members of that generation. So it was uneven, but the war was such a searing experience for them that they didn't want to have that kind of a world together, and they were going to devote their lives to it.
What do we learn from them? Or what could current generations learn from this generation?
Well, I get asked that a lot, and we don't want to ever have to face a world war again. But any story that you hear from any of these people who are in these graves or people who survived, they all say the same thing. We wanted to save each other first. That's what the unit would do. And secondly, we believed in the values that we had. And no one in a foxhole said, are you a Tea Party member or a Republican or a Democrat? It was, how do we move this thing forward? And I interviewed a veteran just today, and he said, we thought we were going to make it a much better world. That was our goal. That's what we were told we were there for. And he said, I think we failed on that account, but we should never give up on it. They were mission-oriented. They learned discipline at an early age, and they were modest. When they came home, they didn't talk about it, because these guys, they said, were the real heroes, the ones in these graves. I just did my job. And we don't have that anymore. Now everybody looks for a lowercase or uppercase celebrity of some kind. So how you reorient that is pretty tough.
That obviously really makes you think. Max Hastings.
Yeah.
You've read a lot of his work. I don't know whether you saw his piece the other day in the New Year in the London Times. He suggested that as heroic as this generation was, and these guys, the D-Day group, from not only the U.S., but Britain, Canada, and the other countries, it was really the Russians, the Soviets, that won that war.
Well, they had a huge piece in it. They couldn't have won it without us, however, but we couldn't have won it without them. And I make that point wherever I go. I did a lecture here the other night in which I said, look, D-Day was a largest, most successful military invasion in the history of mankind. Never been anything like it before. There will never be again. On the other hand, just a year earlier in Russia, in a place called Kursk, the Russians put up such a fight that the Germans lost 200,000 men and they lost 90,000 tanks. I mean, they got hammered, to say nothing of Stalingrad and the expenditure of effort that they were making on the Eastern Front. So I do give the Russians credit.
Last point, when you walk through a place like this, it's staggering, the sites, and it is at the other cemetery sites as well. What does it do to you to walk through here?
I can't talk about it, really. I mean, I just still have a hard time. For one thing, these guys were the ages of my daughters when I first came here, and they came from the Great Plains and the big cities. And when they landed on this beach, they were 19 and 20 years old. And the chances they were going to die were really good. They didn't think they would. And so they all supported each other in a way. They all talked about that. And what I take back from it is that, I always go back to this, the Depression formed them. They learned about deprivation and working together and about sacrifice. And then they made the ultimate sacrifice on this beach. You didn't hear any whining from their families. You know, we had a hero in our family who died on D-Day, or died on Iwo Jima, or died in Okinawa, or died another way. They didn't say it was unfair because they knew the stakes were so big. And I think that's the lesson that I take away from here. What I often do with friends is that, because I can exercise a little influence, when the gates close here at 6 o'clock at night, I've made arrangements like at 7:30 when you have that great northern light. And I'll bring people here for the first time and I'll say, you go down 40 yards that way, you 40 yards this way, and you each take a row and walk from back there to the beachhead. And when you get there, your life will change and your knees will buckle. And they say, oh, okay. And invariably they get there, and their knees have buckled, and their life, they've walked away and said, oh my God, we should have everybody looking at these grave sites. So that's how I feel.
It's been a treat.
It's great.
Thank you.
I didn't mean to break down quite so much. But